Welcome to the extended version of this lesson on the setup. We just covered what the setup is, why it's so difficult to get right, and how it impacts both the beginning and ending of your story. Now, let's dive deeper into the why behind the setup, a trick to start your story with a bang, and talk about the exact length that your setup should be. Then we'll look at an in-depth example in 2011's Bridesmaids. We already covered two reasons the setup is so important. First, it provides contrast with the catalyst to show just how impactful it is on the protag's life. We're going to talk about the catalyst in the next lesson, but it is arguably the most important step of your story, since it is what the story is about. And without the setup, we don't have any context by which to measure its impactfulness. And second, it shows us the protag's baseline before they start their journey. This not only helps us understand the scope of their change, but also helps illuminate the strangeness and difficulty of the journey. There are two more reasons the setup is so critical. First, it is one of the only two steps that are out of the story bounds. This may sound odd since it is obviously part of your story, but what we mean by this is that the true story, the premise or plot, starts during the catalyst and ends during the story climax. We often label this as the journey, since the catalyst sparks it and the story climax resolves it. You can imagine the setup, as well as the aftermath, as bookends to your plot. Thinking about them this way helps grasp the setup's third function, to ramp up into the story. This is the warm-up before the workout, the lining up of cars before the checkered flag starts the race. It gives the audience a moment to settle into the story before it actually starts. And keeping this in mind will help you pace your setup perfectly. The last reason the setup matters so much is because, alongside the hesitation, it helps showcase the ordinary world of Act 1. The term ordinary world is used a lot in story structure, and it basically means the environment the protag starts off in. And the ordinary world should be as different as possible from the new situation of Act 2. It's why Blake Snyder uses the terms thesis and antithesis to describe the first two acts, and uses the term upside down to describe the world of Act 2. Think of the contrast between Moana's peaceful island of Act 1 and the unforgiving ocean of Act 2, or Legally Blonde's cheerful sorority house of Act 1 and the stuffy Harvard campus of Act 2. The setup helps provide the context of the ordinary world so that it can be contrasted by the new situation. Next, let's talk about a trick to start your story with a bang. It's something we call the glimpse of evil, and it's used a lot in horror, thriller, or stories with powerful antags. Instead of starting the story on the protag, the glimpse of evil starts the story by showing us the antag. Sometimes we see the antag, like in Scream or Mulan. Sometimes we don't, like in Jaws or Get Out. And sometimes it's used like a prologue to set up an important element in the story, like the prophecy in the Lego Movie. The most common use is in horror, when we see the monster attacking a victim. And when you think about it, it makes sense. We want to set the tone for our film, so what better way to start off a horror movie than with some horror? The glimpse of evil won't work in every story, but keep it in your back pocket as a very useful tool. Finally, let's talk about the perfect length for your setup. If you've read any books on screenwriting, you have probably been bombarded with page numbers for where your setup should end and your catalyst or inciting incident should begin. And while this advice is founded, since you don't want to bore your audience, it is not as clear-cut as these structuralists make it out to be. There are plenty of movies where the catalyst comes late. Our favorite is Rocky, where the setup lasts almost an hour before Rocky is asked to fight Apollo Creed. The truth is, there is no perfect length for your setup. It should last however long it needs to last, but it shouldn't last a second longer. In other words, the setup should introduce everything you need to start your story as efficiently as possible, because a setup that's too long is just as harmful as a setup that's too short. That being said, 90% of the time, you should skip your prologue. Now, let's see the setup in action with our in-depth example.
Bridesmaids is a 2011 romantic comedy that follows Annie, a failed baker, as she struggles to help plan her best friend Lillian's wedding. Its setup does a great job of showcasing the protag's life before the catalyst, making it a perfect in-depth example. The story starts with Annie having a wild night with Ted. Even though he's an asshole, Annie still settles for his one-night stands. It's clear Annie is looking for a relationship, which plays into her want, which we'll cover soon. Next, Annie spends time with her best friend Lillian, and the two pass by Annie's failed bakery. We then see Annie at her job as a jewelry saleswoman and finish it off by seeing her living situation with two very strange roommates, where we discover Annie is late for rent. One thing you'll notice is that this covers the home, work, and play Snyder mentions by showing us Annie's apartment and roommates, her current and past job, and her time with her best friend and friend with benefits. It definitely gives us a great before snapshot of Annie, alongside a well-rounded view of her life and the ordinary world. This phase also does a great job of introducing Annie's want and her flaw. Her want is arguably stability, since she wants a stable job, a stable relationship, and a stable living situation. But her flaw is that she has given up. She's settling for a crummy relationship, job, and living situation, so of course she won't be able to find stability. Later, in Annie's epiphany, side character Megan will deliver her a speech all about Annie being her own problem and her own solution, and encouraging her to seize her own life. And one of the best parts of this setup is how it sets up all the things that will go wrong later in the story. Later, Annie will lose her job, be kicked out by her roommates, and split with her friend with benefits. So each scene is not only working to highlight Annie's flaw and her want, but is also introducing us to multiple areas of her life to set up all the places where she'll fail. As we said, this phase needs to work double or triple duty at all times. Overall, Bridesmaid's success comes in part from its hilarity, but don't forget the storytelling. An efficient setup can do wonders, especially if it can accomplish everything it needs to in just over 10 minutes like Bridesmaids does.
You should now have a good understanding of the setup, including what it does, why it matters, and how it impacts the end of your story. And in the next lesson, we're going to get the story started as we surprise the protag with something that will change their life forever.